Curious Lloyd.
Generally speaking, having a bad vacation or a holiday, or whatever you guys are happy with calling it, means that you're not happy with the food, the hotel, or the false description and reviews that are given to you. Also, you have to put up with petty people, but these 5 cases I'm about to show you are definitely worse than all of that. So if I were you, I'd count yourselves lucky, but seriously, I really do think these people were all in the wrong place at the wrong time. A honeymooning couple gets caught in 6 different natural disasters. A newly wedded couple, Stefan and Erica Stravenstrom, set off on their honeymoon in 2011 to Queensland, Australia, with their infant daughter in tow. Not every honeymoon goes according to plan, but Stefan and Erica's trip was more like hell. These people had such absurdly bad luck that I can only assume they broke a bunch of mirrors or walked under many ladders. First of all, their flight to Australia was held up by an epic snowstorm, which stranded them in a German airport. But that's not so bad. But you're probably thinking, weather messes up flights all the time, and seeing as how Erica previously survived the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, that was practically nothing in her eyes. But when they finally made it to Queensland, a massive cyclone struck the city, and the couple was forced to hide out in a shopping centre for 24 hours. They planned to head to Brisbane, but then the city was promptly hit by a massive flood. Instead, they went to Perth. Perth, of course, immediately burst into flames. Australia wasn't going so great, so they headed off to New Zealand, a peaceful land of sheep and hobbits unfortunately. Their intended destination, Christchurch, was heavily damaged in an earthquake and resulted in floods. So they finally decided to give up on that continent and headed to Japan in February of 2011, which thankfully went alright, although they probably overspent on their budget a little bit. A Chicago resident is drafted by Saddam Hussein. The US Army never disclosed this poor unfortunate person's name, and he's probably not eager to be associated with this ordeal, so as I can't find his name anywhere, I will just call him Jim. On August 2nd, 1990, Chicago-based college student Jim was visiting family in his native Baghdad when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Before Jim could get out of the country, he was caught up in the slapdash mass drafting of Iraqi men and sent off to war. Shockingly, Hussein did not accept. Fast forwarding this story 6 months, and the American Armed Forces are in Kuwait, beating the Iraqi army. The US Navy and the Air Force bombarded the ever-loving hell out of the occupied Kuwait island of Kwa, and then sent some Navy SEALs ashore to finish them up. Jim became one of the first prisoner of wars of the Gulf War when he ran up to those Navy SEALs, while literally wearing a t-shirt and Bermuda shorts, and said, "Where have you guys been? We've been waiting for you," in a heavy Chicago accent. After checking their GPS a few times to make sure they'd landed in the right place, they sent Jim to an American prison camp, which is where he ran into a sergeant he knew from Illinois. They had the most awkward "what have you been up to" conversation in history. It's unclear what ultimately happened to Jim, but this whole war in the Middle East thing has gone so smoothly, so I'm sure he's fine. An army veteran is put onto the no-fly list and has to illegally immigrate back to America. The no-fly list has its faults. What with active duty soldiers and children, and prominent Congressman Tom McClintock and US Senator Ted Kennedy getting caught up in the ever-trawling net of justice, and it's essentially impossible to get off that list, even if you should never have been on it in the first place. Even if you're a US Army veteran, like Raymond Earl Nebel. Nebel, who recently converted to Islam, was returning home from Colombia, where he was getting married, but when Nebel tried to board a plane home to the US with his lovely new wife, he was told that he and American airspace were not meant to be together. When he asked the US Embassy for help, they seized his passport and interrogated him. So what kind of real US citizen in trouble would show up to an embassy with a valid passport and ask for help? Nebel figured that if he couldn't fly to America, he'd have to head to the Mexican border town and take a cab the last few miles to the US. But when Nebel landed in Mexico, the police arrested him, interrogated him, and deported him back to Colombia. Even worse, Nebel lost his job because he was unable to attend a mandatory medical screening, so he was broke, stateless, and helpless. Nebel set out to America the old-fashioned way, which was also the illegal way, as he made his way by bus on foot through Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and all of Mexico. He was arrested 3 more times and repeatedly interrogated. Thankfully, he made it to America, where he was then detained by US officials and interrogated again for another 10 hours. An American goes to South Korea to teach, but gets drafted and sent to Afghanistan instead. An American college student named Young Chung found himself stranded with a lot of student debt, so he decided to spend a year in his parents' home country of South Korea, teaching English and saving money. He figured his biggest problem would be that he didn't speak Korean. His biggest problem, though, ended up being Taliban gunfire. Upon arriving in Korea, he discovered he was in fact a Korean citizen, which meant he was eligible for compulsory military service. He then panicked. He tried to renounce his Korean citizenship in case his number came up, but this is impossible to do if you're over 18. He then asked for an exemption from the military. But unfortunately, a famous Korean-American pop star had just renounced his Korean citizenship to avoid military service. Chun was left with a few choices: join the Korean army, where he didn't speak the language, try to swim for freedom, or run to a US military base and ask if they'd take him on as a recruit instead. So he went to the latter option and went over to an American Air Force base to sign up. But as Private Chun was waiting to board the American military aircraft out of Korea, Korean customs agent pulled him out of the line and drafted him into their army on the spot. Chun was assigned to a unit and pushed through basic training, then sent to Afghanistan to work as a translator between Korean and American troops. Despite the little fact that he couldn't speak Korean, Chun completed the entire mandatory 2 years and was then discharged, although he probably did pick up some Korean after all. A clerical error lands an innocent tourist in an Indonesian jail for 11 years. This next story is quite inspirational and proves anything is achievable by keeping a determined mindset. An Australian man and a well-meaning friend, Chris V. Parnell, made a big mistake in 1985. He invited a friend on a family vacation to Bali, Indonesia. This was a mistake because the said friend was named Doggy. Doggy was secretly smuggling large amounts of cannabis, but Indonesia's usual punishment for foreign drug smuggling is death by firing squad. Unfortunately, a police officer mixed up whose fingerprints were whose, and Chris was stuck with the charges instead. Doggy was released and immediately hopped on the first flight to somewhere that wasn't Indonesia. But seriously, who would do something like that to a friend? Chris faked insanity by befriending the cockroaches inhabiting his jail cell and got moved into a mental hospital. He then attempted to escape by running across the roof, but the roof collapsed under his feet, landing him in the ward for the criminally insane, where crazed killers, chained to the walls, tried to pull him apart. But thankfully, he was rescued and sentenced to life without parole in the infamously brutal Kirabakan prison. Chris managed to escape again, and he got his hands on a passport, but it was a woman's, so he had to cross-dress. He was almost instantly recognised by an off-duty Kirabakan prison guard. This would turn out to be an hilarious series of unfortunate events, if not for all the horrible torture he had received. But he was horribly tortured for each escaped attempt, which is particularly rough since Chris unsuccessfully tried to escape 3 more times. Years later, Chris was then repeatedly stabbed in his sleep by a gang and declared dead. His body was then transported to the morgue, where it lay for 6 hours before someone realised he was still alive. The attack Chris received cost him his left eye, a ruptured spleen, a ruptured lung. But the thing is, the life-saving blood transfusion Chris received at the hospital infected him with hepatitis A, B, and C, and then suffered a stroke. Eventually, Amnesty International threatened to take Indonesia to the world of court to get Chris released, and it actually worked. After 11 years in prison, Chris went home and lived happily ever after. But he went home and was diagnosed with liver cancer. But if you're not already surprised, Chris survived the cancer because he wasn't going to go through all of that and just come home and die. He even wrote a book about the experience called The Sunday Smuggler. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, and I will catch you again next week. An American college student named Young Chun found himself stranded with a lot of student debt. No surprise there!